Please turn in your Bibles today to the book of Numbers, chapter 20, and place a marker in Deuteronomy, chapter 3. Numbers chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 3. Today when I read, I'm going to be reading from the New International Version. For the past few weeks, we've been in a series. What's it called? Very good. The Heart of a Leader. In this series, we're talking about several attributes that are extremely important for leaders to have in their lives. And to do that, we're looking at the lives of some of the greatest leaders in the Bible. In week number 1, we talked about King Solomon, and we talked about how important it is to have wisdom as a leader. And then in week 2, we talked about Joshua as he took over leading the nation of Israel when Moses had died, and we talked about leading with courage. And then last week, we started a 2-part message where we're looking at the life of Moses as he led the nation of Israel out of Egyptian captivity. In this 2-part message, we're discussing the importance of a leader having patience. Last week, we talked about how the Oxford Dictionary defines patience as the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. And I told you that as we look at a couple of stories from Moses' time leading the Israelites, we're going to examine 3 specific groups of people with which leaders need to have patience. Last week, we talked about just the first group, which is the people that they're leading. Christina, you turn this fan off, please. Leaders need to have patience with the people they're leading. We read a passage last week from Exodus chapter 17 where the nation of Israel was in an area where there was no water for them to drink. And we read how the people began to grumble against Moses. The Bible actually tells us that Moses prayed, and he told the Lord that the people were ready to stone him. So God told Moses to take his staff and to strike a particular rock. And as soon as Moses hit that rock with his staff, what happened? Water started flowing out, enough for the Israelites and all of their animals to drink. As we looked at that story, we talked about how this was not the first time, nor was it the last time that the Israelites would find themselves in an uncomfortable situation and would begin to grumble against Moses and Aaron and ultimately against God. I mentioned how it'd be easy to read about this group of people and to come to the conclusion that they were a pessimistic, petty, and ungrateful group of people. But then I told you that what I would call them is normal. The Israelites were just normal people with lives that were filled with frustration and fear. And when normal people get frustrated and scared, what do? They grumble. They complain. They whine. We talked about how Moses, more often than not, responded in a very specific way. The first thing that Moses would do was he would pray. He would ask the Lord what he should do. And then he would have an open and honest conversation with the people that he was leading. And then finally, if necessary, he would take action. That is how a good leader responds in patience when the people that they're leading begin to grumble. Well, today we're going to move on to another story from Moses' life, and we're going to look at another couple of people with whom leaders need to show patience. To do that, I want us to look at Numbers chapter 20. We're going to start in verse number 2. This is what it says. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Boy, does this story sound familiar or what? Listen, before we go any further, I want you to know something. This is not the same story that we read last week. I didn't read the wrong text today. The text that we read last week was in Exodus chapter 17. This is in Numbers chapter 20. And it's not just the fact that these two narratives are in different books of the Bible. They also occurred roughly 40 years separated from one another. You see, the story that we read last week happened just as the Israelites had run away from Egypt. And this story that we're reading about today takes place after they'd been wandering in the wilderness, for 38 to 40 years. This happened after the incident where Moses sent the 12 spies to examine the land of Canaan, and they came back with their report, and the people rebelled against God. And the Lord said, listen, every single one of you who's above the age of 20, you're not going to go see the promised land. So they wandered in the wilderness waiting on everyone to die. So in this story that we're reading today, not only have the Israelites watched as God has provided for them in situation after situation after situation. He's given them great military victories, and he's provided manna for them, and he's provided quail for them, and he's made it to where their clothing didn't wear out as they wandered in the wilderness. God has done so many miracles for them, and they've seen every one. But not only that, they've also seen God provide for them in a situation that is identical to the one that they're in. You would think that having been through that, they would say, hey, I remember when we didn't have water last time. Moses struck the rock. There was water. God provided for us. I'm sure he's going to do it again. But instead, the people got scared, and they got frustrated, and they began to grumble. Let's look at how God responds. We're going to pick back up in verse 6 of Numbers chapter 20. It says, Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Verse number 12, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Well, that didn't go quite like Moses would have hoped it did it? That didn't go real well for Moses. Let's recap here. It's been nearly 40 years since God told Moses to strike a rock, and water began to pour out. And this whole time, the Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness. This whole time, Moses has led them faithfully. And this whole time, they have repeated a cycle of praising God in the good times and grumbling in the bad times. And here they are, yet again, in an identical situation where they are in an area with no water. And instead of calmly approaching Moses and saying, hey, can you talk to God about getting us some water? They begin to grumble at him. I read this story about the Israelites, and it feels like they're singing that old song from Hee Haw. You guys remember that song? Gloom, despair, and agony on me. Everyone under the age of 35 is like, what are you talking about, Pastor? So Moses does what he should do. He prays. And he asks God what to do. But either Moses didn't listen closely to God's answer, or he just got so angry and so frustrated with his followers that he loses his temper and he does something he shouldn't do. You see, the last time this happened, God told Moses to do what? Strike the rock. But this time, he didn't say that, did he? This time, what did he say? Speak to the rock. Speak to that rock, and you will bring forth water. But Moses doesn't speak to it. Instead, he strikes it again. And in that moment of weakness, that moment of frustration, that moment of anger, Moses' decision cost him the most valuable thing that he possessed: the promise of entering the land of Canaan. Church, the second person that you need to have patience with when you're a leader is yourself. Do me a favor. Raise your hand if you're a leader. Now, in case you don't remember, that's everybody. So raise your hand if you're a leader. Kerrigan, get your hand up. There you go. Now, keep your hands up. If you're a leader, keep your hand up. Now, here's what I want you to do. If you've never made a mistake in leadership, keep your hand in the air. Now, look around. See who's still got their hand up. Listen to me. If you are leading, you are going to make a mistake. You are going to make several mistakes. That's just the way it is. What matters is how you respond to those mistakes. Too many people will make a mistake in leadership, and they refuse to give themselves the same grace, the same courtesy, and the same patience that they would give another person who had done the same thing. If you're here today and you're one of these people, you know what I'm talking about. You are so hard on yourself. You'll make a mistake and you will punish yourself for weeks, if not months. Sometimes even years. I've seen these people chastise themselves and sometimes even disqualify themselves from leadership entirely. They make the decision, you know what? I just don't have what it takes. I'm not going to lead anymore. I make too many mistakes. Moses could have done this. Moses could have realized that not only did he make a mistake, he made a mistake acting on behalf of the Lord himself. Moses could have decided, you know what? I'm just not cut out for this. I don't have the patience that it takes. I don't have the wisdom that it takes. I don't have the courage that it takes. I don't have the stuff that I need to be a good leader. So I'm just going to quit. God needs to find someone else to lead the Israelites. He could have decided he was done with leading, but Moses didn't do that. Moses picked himself up and carried on. Moses didn't wallow in self-pity, and he didn't give up on leading people. He acknowledged his mistake. I assume he learned from it, and he moved on. He had patience with himself. He had the ability to forgive himself. And he continued to fulfill his role as leader until the end of his life. As leaders, we will often face moments of disappointment and failure, similar to what Moses must have experienced when he made this mistake, and then the Lord reprimanded him for it. At times, we will make mistakes and will fall short of the goal or the task, or will fall short of our own expectations for what a leader should do or be. But when that happens, we need to remember that we are human. And what that means is we're not perfect. In the famous words of Pam Halpert, "Pobody's nerfect." Pobody's nerfect. We all mess up. When that happens, we need to respond as Moses did, having patience with ourselves and continuing to lead with humility and perseverance. Now listen, I know that some of you don't have a problem in this area, and that is great. Man, if you are able to just forgive yourself and move on, I love that. That's a good thing. But unfortunately, some people do struggle with this. There are people in this world, and maybe even in this room, who are so angry with themselves about a previous mistake that they made in leadership that they have made the decision that they won't lead anymore. They refuse to step up and lead because they feel like if they do, they're just going to mess up again. Because they either can't forgive themselves or they can't stand the thought of messing up again. Let me tell you something, church. If you lead, you will make mistakes, and you must be patient with yourself. You must learn to live with yourself, to forgive yourself. To find the next group of people that a leader needs to be patient with, I want us to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 3. We're going to look at verses 23 through 29. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses gives the Israelites a recap of everything that has happened since they left Egypt. Moses knows he's getting ready to die, and he calls the assembly together. They're getting ready to cross the Jordan and go into the promised land. So he gives them the whole story from beginning to end. And in verses 23 through 29, Moses tells the people about a conversation that he had with the Lord after this incident with striking the rock. This is what Moses says in verse 23. He says, "At that time I pleaded with the Lord. Sovereign Lord, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do the deeds and the mighty works that you do?" When I read this, it reminds me of my kids when they're getting ready to ask me for something. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do the deeds and the mighty works that you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country and Lebanon. Moses says, "But because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. That is enough," the Lord said. "Do not speak to me anymore about this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and look west and north and south and east. Look at the land with your own eyes, since you are not going to cross this Jordan. But commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will lead his people across and will cause them to inherit the land that you will see." And Moses says, "So we stayed in the valley near Beth Peor." Church, can you imagine? Moses, who God called all those years ago to go to Egypt and confront Pharaoh, who God called to lead his people out of captivity, and who spent 40 plus years putting up with those people's whining and complaining as he led them in the wilderness. He goes to God and he says, "Listen, I know I messed up, but you're a good and a powerful God. Please let me go into the promised land." And God says, "That's enough. Don't bring it up again." If you're a parent, how many times have you said that? Man, can't you just, you can feel that statement, can't you? God he said, that's enough. Don't bring it up again. Makes you wonder how many times Moses pleaded with the Lord, pleaded his case. The third person that a leader needs to have patience with is God. Pastor, you sure you want to say that? Listen, let me remind you what patience is. The capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. Listen, does God ever move more slowly than you wish he would? Does God ever allow you to go through trouble that you wish he would just not? Does God ever allow you to go through suffering even when you're praying every day for healing? See, church, I'm not saying that God isn't right 100% of the time. I believe he is. I know he is. He's right in everything that he does. But just because he's right doesn't make it any more comfortable to go through. That doesn't make it any more fun. I can know that God's right and still not like it. Listen, I'll be honest with you. I was in a restaurant less than a mile from here on Friday, and I was talking to a good friend of mine who's a pastor, and I was sharing with him some of my frustrations and concerns about areas in my leadership and even in this church where God's not moving as quick as I wish he would. Listen, it doesn't hurt the Lord's feelings for you to be honest, okay? But I was talking to this friend, and he made a statement, and I laughed so loud. He said, I've often made the statement, God is never late, but he sure passes up a lot of opportunities to be early. Isn't that so true? He's never late, but he passes up a lot of opportunities to be early. If you're going to be a Christian leader, you have to learn to be patient with the Lord. Because he's not always going to do things in your timing. And sometimes he's not going to do what you want him to do at all. But even in those moments of delay, in those moments of trouble, in those moments of suffering, we have to choose to be patient with God, just like Moses did. Imagine Moses standing before the Lord, pleading to enter the promised land. The Bible says he pleaded with God after everything that he had done for God. After everything that he had put up with, after everything that he had been through for the Lord, he pleaded with them, but God's response was not what Moses had hoped for. God said, that's enough. Don't bring it up again. What frustration must he have felt in that moment? He had been so close, yet was being denied entry. The thing that he had been waiting for and working for and striving for so long wouldn't be his. I'll tell you what, it would have been real easy for Moses to say, you know what? I'm crossing that river. You say, well, no, he would never do that. Well, why do you? Come on now, don't tell me that God has never told you no and you've said yes. Don't we do it? Don't we twist and push and do whatever we can to just make it happen even if it's not God's timing? Make a mess of the whole situation? But Moses didn't do that. Here's the remarkable thing about Moses. Despite his disappointment, despite his frustration, he chose to have patience with God. He chose to accept suffering without getting angry or upset. So, well, how do you know that, Pastor? Well, I know that because I've read Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 3 and 4. You see, the Lord tells Moses to climb the mountain and to look at the land that he's never going to enter. Moses climbs the mountain and he knows he's getting ready to die. And listen to what he says in verses 3 and 4 of Deuteronomy 32. I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. You tell me that's not a man who's leading with patience. You tell me that's not a man who's learned how to accept a situation even though he doesn't like it. Now, I told you before, it's easy for us to get frustrated with God, and it's okay for us to be honest. The Lord knows what you think and what you feel anyway, so it's all right to be honest. Don't lie to him. But when you're done being honest, you better straighten up your attitude and learn how to accept it without getting angry or upset. That's what patience with God looks like. Moses recognized that even though God wasn't doing the things that he wished he would, that God's ways were still perfect and just. And instead of harboring bitterness or resentment, Moses chose to praise God for his greatness and his faithfulness. As leaders, we need to learn from Moses' example. When we inevitably encounter situations in our life where we don't understand what God has chosen to do, why he allows certain things to happen, or why he doesn't answer our prayers the way that we expect or the way that we think he should, when we are in those situations, we have to have patience with God. We have to remember that his ways are higher than our ways, and that he sees the bigger picture that we can't comprehend, we can't understand. That even though we may not understand God's timing or his plans, that we have to trust that he is faithful and he is just. Having patience with God means trusting him even when you don't understand or don't agree. It means surrendering our desires and accepting his ways because they're perfect. Today we're talking about the heart of a leader. We're talking about leading with patience. A leader needs to have patience with the people that they're leading, with themselves when they mess up, and they need to have patience with God. I'm going to ask everyone in the room to bow your head and close your eyes. Earlier today, I asked you to raise your hand if you're a leader, and you all raised your hands without any prompting from me. So today I have another question. You're a leader, and you struggle with having patience with yourself. You struggle with forgiving yourself for the mistakes that you make and moving on. If that's you, I want you to lift up your hand. You say, I need help being patient with myself. Hands all over the room. Second question I have is this. You are in a situation where you don't understand why God's moving so slowly, or you don't understand why he's moving the direction that he is. You're frustrated with him. You're angry with him, and there's a little bit of bitterness starting to grab a hold in your heart. And today you're here and you say, you know what, Pastor, I need the Lord to forgive me. I need him to take that bitterness away. And I need him to help me learn how to trust him and be patient with him. If that's you, lift up your hand. Lord, I love you so much. I'm thankful for your word. I'm thankful for the example that we have in Moses. Lord, when he messed up, when he disobeyed you, he could have decided he was done, that he didn't have what it took, that you needed to find someone else. But instead, he accepted what he had done. And he kept moving forward. Lord, you saw those who lifted their hands today that said, man, I struggle to forgive myself. I struggle to have patience with myself. Lord, I pray that you'll help us in this area, that you'll give us the strength that we need to understand that no one's perfect, that we're going to mess up, and that that's okay. Lord, give us patience with ourselves. Lord, I pray for those who have disqualified themselves in their own minds from positions of leadership because they're scared to mess up again. Lord, I pray that you'll strengthen them. You'll encourage them. You give them the strength that they need to put themselves out there. And then when they do mess up again, that you'll remind them to be patient with themselves. Lord, I pray for those who said they struggle with being patient with you. God, I know that you don't always do things the way we would want them to be done. Sometimes you don't work in the timing that we would like to see. And sometimes you do things completely differently than we'd like them to be done. Lord, give us the strength to trust you, to know that you know what's best and that you have a plan for your people, that you have a plan for your church. Lord, help us be willing and able to accept delay and suffering and trouble without getting angry or upset. Forgive us for the bitterness in our hearts and clean it out, God. I praise you and thank you. In Jesus' name.